It's late. The house is still, and the world outside has fallen quiet. But in the theater of your mind, the show is just beginning. The feature presentation, a collection of moments you would rather forget. That time you waved with such confidence to someone who wasn't looking at you at all. The joke that landed in a room filled with sudden, heavy silence. The moment you fell, not down the stairs, but up them, in front of the one person you hoped to impress. You feel it, even now. A tightening in your chest, a ghost of heat in your face. It's a feeling that seems to arrive on its own. And you have likely asked the quiet room, why this? Why now? Of all the things I've done, why this one? If you have ever felt haunted by the ghost of a past self, you are not alone in this private cinema. And perhaps more importantly, your brain is not trying to torture you. It believes it is trying to protect you. There is an ancient reason your mind clings to these moments, and to understand it, we have to go deeper. Before we look into the past, it helps to understand what this experience actually is, because it's more than a thought, isn't it? It arrives in the quiet moments, in the shower, on a long drive with no music, or just before sleep, when the world goes silent and the noise of the day can no longer drown it out. And as everything else fades, something inside becomes louder. The memory appears, sharp, uninvited. You are not just remembering. You are reliving. Your brain isn't simply replaying a scene. It's recreating the feeling. The warmth climbs your neck. Your stomach tightens. Your jaw clenches slightly. Your body reacts as if it is happening again. Because to the brain, memory is not the past. It is a simulation of the present. The philosopher Henri Bergson once suggested that memory is not a drawer we open. It is something alive, continuously reshaping itself in the light of who we are now. Modern neuroscience has confirmed what he could only sense intuitively. Every time you recall a memory, you are not reading from a fixed file, you are reconstructing it. And in that reconstruction, the emotion and the physical sensation are woven in, inseparable from the facts. This is why certain memories don't just think at you. They breathe. They have temperature. They arrive with a body. The content of these memories is almost universal. Forgetting a name just after hearing it, sending a message to the wrong person, saying something that felt right until it didn't. The brain does not catalog these as small mistakes. It treats them as fractures in something deeper. The quiet rules of how to belong, and the more you return to them, the deeper they settle. Each replay strengthens the pathway back. It becomes a kind of rehearsal, not chosen, but repeated. So the question becomes not just why we remember these moments, but why they feel so urgent, why they refuse to let go. To understand that, we have to go back, not to the moment itself, but tens of thousands of years. For most of human history, survival depended on one thing above all else: belonging. To be accepted by the group meant food. It meant shelter. It meant a future. And to be rejected, to violate the unspoken rules of the tribe, was not uncomfortable. It was final. And so the brain evolved to take social mistakes very seriously, not as small errors, but as potential threats. Threats that had to be remembered, studied, never repeated. This is where the amygdala comes in. It acts like a sentry, constantly scanning the landscape of your experience for anything that carries emotional weight. When it detects fear, shame, or embarrassment, it triggers an alarm. That alarm releases a cascade of stress signals, cortisol, adrenaline, the body's ancient emergency language, and that signal is passed to the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for long-term memory. The message is simple. This matters, save it. Don't lose it. This is why you can remember a single awkward moment from years ago with perfect, almost cinematic clarity. But not what you ate last Tuesday. Your brain is not a scrapbook for pleasant afternoons. It is a survival guide written in moments of fear. And this system is deepened by something called the negativity bias. And this is where something subtle shifts. Your brain gives more weight, more attention, more storage space to negative experiences. Because for our ancestors, missing a pleasant moment had no cost, but missing a threat, overlooking a warning sign, could end everything. The psychologist Rick Hanson put it simply. The brain is like Velcro for negative experiences and Teflon for positive ones. But there is another layer. We don't just remember these moments, we amplify them. This is known as the spotlight effect. We assume others notice us far more than they actually do. Because we live inside our own perspective, it feels as though we are central in every room, every conversation, every moment. But in reality, most people are absorbed in their own thoughts, their own private theater, their own memories playing quietly in the background. They likely didn't notice. And if they did, they forgot quickly. But your brain didn't. It recorded the moment as if it mattered deeply to everyone present, when in truth, it only mattered to you. And this is where it becomes more personal. Because these memories don't just sit quietly in storage. They return, especially in the silence, especially in the dark. This is the work of what neuroscientists call the default mode network, the part of your brain that activates when you are not focused on a task, when there is no external demand to meet. When the world slows down, this network begins to wander. It revisits the past. It builds meaning. It searches for unresolved things. And because of everything we've just described, it tends to pull the memories marked important, unresolved, do not repeat. Your brain is not being cruel. It is reviewing, trying to protect you from a danger that may have passed decades ago, even if it no longer needs to. But something else is happening here, something that deserves to be named. These memories don't just return, they hurt. That sinking feeling, the heat in your face, the sudden discomfort, as if you could step outside your own skin. It is not imagined, it is not weakness. And this is where it stops being just a memory. In 2003, neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger and her team at UCLA published research showing that social rejection activates the dorsal anterior cingulate cortex, the same region of the brain that processes physical injury. On a neurological level, a broken heart is not just a metaphor. The brain uses the same language for both, the language of pain. Because for most of human history, social rejection was physical danger. The tribe that turned you away left you exposed to the cold, to predators, to starvation, and so the brain never separated the two. The body does not care if the threat is gone. It only remembers that it once was real. What you're feeling is not embarrassment. It's your brain remembering a time when mistakes had consequences. So when you cringe at a memory from years ago, a sentence you stumbled through, a look you misread, a moment that lingered longer than it should have, you are not just thinking about it. You are feeling a real echo of something your nervous system once marked as dangerous. It lives in the body, not just the mind. The memory is not just a thought. It has weight. The philosopher Seneca wrote 2,000 years ago, "There are more things likely to frighten us than there are to crush us. We suffer more in imagination than in reality." He was describing anxiety, but he might just as well have been describing memory, because memory, too, is a form of imagination, not false, but active, alive. So how do you learn to set it down? Trying to force these thoughts away does not work. Most of us have tried. We push the memory down. We tell ourselves not to think about it. We try to move on. But resistance gives a thought energy. The psychologist Daniel Wegner called this the ironic process. The harder you try not to think of something, the more present it becomes, because the mind, in trying to monitor whether you are succeeding, keeps the very thought alive. So the path forward is not to fight your brain, but to work with it, to teach it slowly, gently, that the threat has passed. When the memory appears, instead of being pulled into it, you can meet it with something else. Curiosity, not analysis, not judgment, not the urgent need to explain yourself to yourself. Just curiosity, the quiet kind, the kind that holds something gently and asks, "What is this really?" You can ask, "Does this moment define my life? Is anyone else still thinking about this? What would I say to someone I care about if they told me this story?" You are not denying the memory. You are placing it in a larger, more honest context. You are telling your nervous system, "We are safe now. Every memory is a fact, but the meaning we attach to it is a choice." And the story can change. From "This proves something is wrong with me," to "This was a moment I was still learning." You are not rewriting the past. You are changing its weight. And perhaps the most important shift, the one that requires the most gentleness, is to respond not with criticism, but with something softer. Because shame isolates. It convinces you that you are uniquely flawed, that others move through the world with a kind of ease you somehow missed. But the truth is simpler and kinder. To be human is to make mistakes, to be awkward sometimes, to misjudge, to say the wrong thing in exactly the wrong moment. This is not failure. It is the price of being part of a social world, the cost of caring what others think, which is itself a kind of connection. And when you begin to see it that way, you can look at that past version of yourself differently, not with judgment, but with something closer to tenderness. They were not failing. They were trying to belong the only way they knew how. There is a quiet irony in all of this. To cringe at a past version of yourself is not a sign of damage. It is a sign of growth. You are not remembering who you were. You are meeting who you have outgrown. These memories are not proof that something is wrong with you. They are proof that your brain is doing exactly what it was built to do. Protect, learn, adapt, even when it holds on longer than it needs to. And once you understand that, something shifts. Not immediately, not completely, but slowly. The way most real things change. The memory does not disappear, but it softens. It becomes something you can sit beside rather than something that sits on top of you. So the next time the private theater opens and the lights dim and the film begins, you don't have to sit through it as if it's new. You can see it for what it is, a lesson that has already done its work, a version of yourself that was doing the best they could. And then, gently, you can let the room go dark. The past has served its purpose, and what remains is simply you, here, now. If this felt familiar to you, you might find something valuable here. You can subscribe if you want to explore more of it. And sometimes, just knowing you're not alone in it is where things start to shift.